We had been previously working on research in teaching science to English language learners, and recognized the synchrony of the work that we've been doing with the work that Roland had been doing with CREDE on the 5 standards. And so our project was focusing on, can we take these ideas, can we integrate these ideas with prior research on teaching science to ELL and the knowledge that we have about general teaching to ELL, and bring those things together in a project. So the grant that we have started later than the Teacher Quality Grant. It's an Institute of Education Science development grant. And they gave us the funding to see if we could translate these ideas into science and develop some instruments to assess that, with a focus on pre-service teacher education. Quite a challenging task for those of you who do not live and work in California. You may not know that all teacher education in California is post-baccalaureate. It's typically a 1-year program. In the CSU system, it's basically 1 semester of coursework, 1 semester of student teaching. So it's a very short and confined program, short intervention to have impact. Just give that context. The team, Roland was served as a senior advisor to the team, myself, Marco, Jorge, Michael Stevens, and Ramon, as I've mentioned. But we also had Isabel Kita, I think you're here somewhere, Isabel. Kita at San Francisco State, and Maxine McKinney, back there, who is a graduate student at Berkeley. Stephanie Lowe, Stephanie here? No. And Jen Collette. There's Jen there. So we had a team that went across 4 institutions, UCSC, UC Berkeley, San Francisco State, and CSU Stanislaus. So one of the challenges of this was actually getting together, and we made liberal use of the conference call technology. So I said it was an IES development grant, and our aim was to integrate the CREDE 5 standards into science in a pre-service teacher education program. In the first year of the project, we focused on developing the intervention, which involved developing a science methods component for the teacher education program and developing research tools. The research tools that CREDE was currently using, although excellent, were sort of generic, and we wanted tools that were actually contextualized in science. It makes it a little bit different. So we've worked on the development of both an observation instrument and a survey, which Marco and Jorge will be talking a little bit more about. So in year 2, we implemented the methods course and collected data on the student teachers. In the CREDE, you'll have a CD, Jim, Roland, you'll have a proceedings. Yeah, in the proceedings, there is a short paper which describes all the findings that we have so far. But because of time constraints today, we're just going to focus on a small piece, which involves the B-clad teachers. But the general findings that we have to date are in that paper, available to everybody. One of the things that's particularly important to me in my work is finding multiple converging lines of evidence. One research group over here says this is great, and they present findings that show the efficacy of their approach. If you can find 2 or 3 groups where the lines of evidence coming from those different perspectives converge, I think it gives it increasing power. And I think that's what we have in the area of science, because there is a separate line of research and several projects in groups of researchers that are focused on science and language integration. For years, Roland and I were colleagues at Santa Cruz, and we debated quite vigorously and realized after a while that we talked past each other a lot of the time. Because when he talked about the CREDE Five Standards, I was looking at each of these things separately. The work that we were doing on science-language integration, recognized belatedly, was actually the integrated level of the standards. I don't know when we had that aha moment. I think it was probably over a glass of wine on Santa Cruz Wharf, but suddenly we realized we were talking about the same thing. And that is one of the issues with these different research groups in different domains. Often we don't use the same language, often we don't communicate with each other, and we're talking about the same thing. But in the science, language, integration literature, which focused a lot on teaching science to English language learners, what is a central concept of that is the integration of language and literacy into the teaching of science. You cannot teach science without teaching language. You can learn as many new words in a science lesson as you do in a foreign language lesson. So you teach language, you teach literacy through science. Drawing on the ELL literature and looking at when students are learning a second language, the importance of contextualization, that it goes all the way through the ELL literature, the importance of contextualizing language and the real problems with the decontextualized use of language. And that's where the aha moment came in for the science ELL people, was because they said inquiry science is the most powerful context for contextualizing language. That you take the words, and while you're engaged in an activity, you're contextualizing the use of words. And so in this synergistic way, the teaching of science enhances the learning of language. But there's another piece that comes into that, which I think is influenced strongly by CREDE and the notion of cognitive complexity. Because one of the things you do when you're talking about science, as you're doing the activity, you're promoting metacognition. You're getting students to think about what they're doing. And when you look at a lot of hands-on inquiry approaches to learning, very often it's fun activity. You hear teachers talk about doing science, it's fun. You know, the children's eyes light up, it's wonderful. But there's a disconnect with the concept. So the simultaneously talking about the activity as you are doing it in a group, where it's contextualized, promotes cognitive complexity. And I think that was the aha we had over probably our second bottle of wine on the Santa Cruz Wharf. Hey, if it works, we got a project out of it. So there's a great deal of literature that you can look at in the science ELL literature which supports CREDE, although it talks about it in a different way. And these were some of the science language integration projects I just wanted to acknowledge that we drew upon. Lasers was a project I worked on. PCEL was Oki Lee's project, and CFER, Jean Garcia, and the Seeds of Science, Roots of Reading, Dave Pearson, and the Lawrence Hall of Science. So these people are all coming at the same ideas from a different perspective. But basically they were doing CREDE level 5 of integration. So one of the things that we had to do in bringing these things together is we had to be able to talk to 3 different groups of people for this to make sense. If we really want these CREDE standards and the work to go into science, we have to use the language of the science ed folks. We have to contextualize it in what they're doing. We also have to contextualize it in for the work of people who are working with ELL. Otherwise, we all talk across each other. And so there is lots of parallels in the science education literature for the CREDE Five Standards, and we have tried to make those linkages. And I've talked a little bit about some of those. But, you know, an instructional conversation. There's a whole approach to science discourse and scientific discourse, which is fundamental to the nature of the discipline. The kind of things you talk about, evidence, proof, all of those things which are part of science discourse have to be integrated into instructional conversation. Contextualization. There are lots of different ways that you contextualize in science. Some of those are relating to the local ecology, the local environment. We work with children in Santa Cruz who live across from huge multi-acre strawberry fields run by agribusiness. Their parents are working in those fields, picking the strawberries. The agribusiness owners are spraying those fields with chemicals that impact the health of the parents. It's contextualized. The science is all around you. So it's very specific forms of contextualization, as well as the things like the funds of knowledge that Lewis Moore talks about, the ways people think about science in different cultures and communities. So taking the CREDE standard of contextualization, we have to elaborate it into what that means in science. One of the things with the Institute of Education Science, as many of you know, is that under the Bush administration, it was heavily influenced by the NIH. Now, Frank might not think that's a bad idea, but some of us struggled with it because they're very, very much into strict experimental methods. And although we've argued back and forth, many of us, that it's quite difficult to do random assignment and to do strict experimental methodology in schools, and have a treatment group and a control group. What do you mean only half the teachers or only half the students are going to get the treatment? No, we can't do, right? So, but we did the best we could to follow that methodology. But it was challenging to randomly assign student teachers into controlled and experimental courses, randomly assign them to master teachers. So it's a challenge. And I see Annala's nodding her head because she knows all about it. But we did do a traditional experimental design. So the control group took a traditional science method class, a lot of which focused on here are the standards, write a lesson plan, here's how you teach science inquiry. In the experimental group, CREDE science methods class, the CREDE Five Standards were completely integrated into the pedagogy. So the student teachers learnt the course through CREDE standards in a very explicit manner. And Jorge's going to talk about that a little bit more. We had more challenge in giving them guidance from a CREDE master teacher. Because of the fact that we had 2 grants, and at some point USDOI decided they wanted distinction between the grants, didn't want a lot of overlap. We didn't have the benefit of using some of these wonderful teachers that Annala and the coaches had trained. We, interestingly enough, found it quite difficult to get the master teachers who work with the student teachers to engage in a lot of professional development. Sometimes cooperating teachers see having a student teacher as a bit of a perk, gives them some free time. Some teachers think of it that way, others don't. We had quite a challenge in trying to engage them in extensive professional development. So we did the best we could, and we actually developed a CD, which the teachers used and worked with some online stuff. So here were our research questions. Does integrating the CFSEP into science methods class and into student teaching, does it prepare student teachers who can more effectively deliver culturally and linguistically responsive teaching? That was our question. And then a second question, just because we wanted to make life difficult for ourselves and we're masochists, we said, and is there any impact on the achievement of students in their classrooms? In the paper, we have the broader results. In this presentation, we're going to focus on the B-class teachers, and specifically how their attitudes changed towards language and literacy, and what did that influence their practice.
So this next part is really trying to give you an overview of what the intervention looked like, what did it entail. And as Trish mentioned, we worked with a biology professor, a science methods professor, and some language educators to construct a science methods course that integrated the CREDE Five Standards in every possible way, from the readings that the students did, the way that they discussed the readings, to the different kinds of activities that they did in their science methods course. And in doing some observations across the campuses, this is sort of what we tended to note took place in the traditional or our control group classes and in our CREDE treatment model. Basically, we saw a lot more of a lecture format in the traditional science methods course. In the CREDE treatment, there was much more interactive and hands-on activities happening. The traditional model was much more self-contained, where the CREDE treatment model had more integration. There was health education, there was language arts built into the science methods course, so it didn't sort of stand alone in that sense. With the traditional model, again, there was just a basic science pedagogy. This is the inquiry cycle, and this is the way it should look like in your lesson plans and how you should unpack your lessons. And in the CREDE treatment model, there was much more sort of considerations for the CREDE Five Standards. One other element that Trish has sort of alluded to is this idea of really bringing coherence between what the students are actually experiencing in their science methods course and what their master teacher or cooperating teacher expects them to do in their placements when they actually go out and do their student teaching. And so we try to, as much as possible, bring coherence to that, but there was some difficulties in getting master teachers involved in some of the professional development, so we put together a DVD that gave them some sense of what the CREDE Five Standards were, some literature. We went out and talked to the master teachers and told them, here's what we're asking the student teacher to come into your classroom and do. At the very least, we expect you to allow them to try and teach this science lesson in these particular ways and provide scaffolding for them in these particular ways. And so, they agreed to do that, and they were rewarded financially for allowing that to happen. One of the things that our biology instructor really sort of built into this course is this idea that teachers needed more background in science, that they needed some more content. And so instead of just talking about science pedagogy, we wanted to integrate much more science content. And so there was life science, physical science, and earth science activities that were built into the course. There was also a lot of science inquiry that was really sort of modeled inside the course. And we really sort of allowed students to talk about the CREDE Five Standards at the onset, practice some activities, and then have some opportunities for some metacognitive discussions about how were the Five Standards exemplified in what you just did. And that really helped them to make sense of how the Five Standards kind of were built into the science methods course. And in this activity, we had students use isopods, which are little roly-polies, sort of your everyday term. And they posed a hypothesis about whether an isopod preferred wet terrain versus dry terrain. And then they sort of went on and tested those hypotheses using sort of the inquiry model. And all along here, what we're really trying to do is is trying to get students, the student teachers, to think about more authentic literacy and language practices. So instead of, for example, having the teacher read a book about Roly the Roly-Poly, for example, that they read a reference book about isopods and find out more information about isopods than what they actually experienced through their first-hand investigations. So this is a little bit of the, sort of the model in which we try to sort of move students towards, is that there was much less lecture happening in the science methods course and much more opportunities to do science. So here, for example, students actually placed an isopod in the center of this circle, and then they put different kinds of terrain in different areas and try to see, sort of over repeated data collection opportunities, which terrain did the isopod prefer. So they read reference books about the activities that they were doing. They wrote scientific reports, and they were involved in science discussions within the context of the science methods course. Probably 2 or 3 years ago, I was overlooking on Roland's shoulder at a previous CREDE conference, and I saw him writing down some boxes of the way in which he represents his course. And it sort of reminded me of this particular model, where we're really trying to get away from really being mostly a lecture format in the science methods course. So the way in which the methods course, each 3-hour session unfolded was, there was sort of a question or some kind of inquiry question that was posed. There was a short lecture that was presented, and then there were some really hands-on activities that took place. I apologize, I don't think that this is in your handout. And then at the end, there's really some opportunities to kind of make sense of what took place during that particular session. And our colleague, Michael Stevens, the biologist, kind of put it best in this particular quote. He says, "Scientists don't just sit around in lecture halls. Instead, scientists work collaboratively in small groups," so this is really exemplifying the joint productive activity, "and discuss and defend their ideas." Sound familiar to instructional conversations. They engage in challenging research, so cognitive complexity there, that helps us better understand how the world works around us. Or you see the contextualization happening there. And they communicate using specific technical vocabulary, reading and writing activities. So you can sort of see how all of these things get represented there. As we've mentioned, we're going to share some of the results that we've been able to gather to date. In fact, as early as just yesterday, we were actually beginning to do some analysis on some of the student science knowledge measures. And unfortunately, we didn't have enough time to do further analysis, but we're going to present on some of the data on the bilingual pre-service teachers that were involved in this program. And as you can sort of imagine, the vast majority of these participants were females. They were both Cantonese and Spanish speaking pre-service teacher candidates. They rated their level of Cantonese or Spanish proficiency at various levels, but mostly they felt that they were both advanced and fluent speakers of that foreign language, or actually their first language in many cases. And we collected a series of data through various tools. We gave students a survey that tried to get at their dispositions towards the integration of the standards. We interviewed a subset of teachers. We gave them a science assessment, and then we also observed them when they were doing their pre-service practicum. And we did this at various sessions, so either in their science methods course, during their clinical practicum, and also we're following these teachers into their first year of teaching. And so they're just now finishing their first year of teaching, and we have a set of data on that as well. But for the purpose of time, we're going to really focus on some survey items and the classroom observations that we've conducted, and we're really going to focus on the language and literacy portion of these two instruments. We're really sort of looking at how language and literacy was being practiced by these teachers, but also the dispositions that they had towards language, literacy, and science integration. And we were looking at these particular 5 domains, whether or not they felt they had sort of strong dispositions towards authentic literacy in the context of science, whether they were using literacy as a tool for learning, and whether they were involving students in more science discourse activities, whether they were focusing on some of the science vocabulary, and whether or not they were drawing on students' primary language. The survey item, it had 23 items that really focused on language and literacy. They were on a Likert scale, and we had some really strong validity on this particular measure. There were both negatively and positively phrased items. And I'll give you sort of an example of a couple. So with relation to language and literacy, we asked teachers to rate their level of agreement to phrases such as discussions about science investigations can take away from the doing of science. And English learners need to be proficient in English language, reading and writing before they are taught science. And writing science is not doing science. So this is really trying to get at how they felt their dispositions towards the integration of these items into their teaching. As was mentioned, we also observed them 3 times, and we had sort of 5 language domains. And the rubric that we developed based on the one that Anola had mentioned previously has also a 4-point scale from 0 to 3. And we score classroom science activities actually every 15 minutes. Because we note that at the onset of science instruction, the teacher needs to do a lot of prep work, a lot of sort of preparing students for what's to happen, either gathering materials and the like. And so we wanted to make sure that we weren't sort of skewing what we were actually observing. So we score every 15 minutes. And as I mentioned, each of these 28 B-clad candidates were observed 3 times each. On the back of your handout, there's a better model of the classroom observation rubric that we use that gives you sort of the dimensions of what we were actually looking for in when we were observing these pre-service bilingual teachers. I'm going to turn it over to Jorge because I know that we're sort of short on time and we don't want to keep you from lunch. So Jorge is going to talk a little bit about some of the findings on these 2 measures.
Great. So I just want to emphasize again that the back of the handout is the list of all the domains that we were looking at when we were doing observations. If you want a look at the rubric, we'll be happy to share that with you later. But for the sake of this presentation, we're focusing on the language domains, and that's what we're reporting on today. And as you can see here, these are some of the results we have for the survey that we gave before the methods course started and after the methods course ended during the science methods course that these participants took for the experimental group. You notice that folks started off sort of high here at 3.56 and has some gains nevertheless over the span of that course. And despite the fact that it is on a 4-point scale, you can see that folks did have some change over time that is positive for the experimental course participants. Again, these are the B-class students. And just sort of trying to unpack some of that, we find that there is increased awareness of the role of literacy in how that plays in student science learning. So that has to do with their awareness that there are authentic science literacy practices that are pertinent to science learning. There's also an increased awareness of the need to involve students, so involving students in discussions about the function of science literacy tools used by scientists. This is going back to, if you recall back what Marco was talking about in the course and what we were trying to emphasize in the course, there's that recognition in their teaching practices as well. Also, there is increased awareness of the need for instructional attention in the area of vocabulary. So folks in the survey reported that is important. It is important for teachers to attend to vocabulary instruction in science. There's also increased view that there is a need for explicit instructional attention in the area of science discourse. And you notice here that we make a distinction between science discourse and science vocabulary, the latter being more of a social practice and the first being more having to do with language development and discrete science concepts, and making evidence-based explanations in terms of science discourse. And there's also an increased awareness of the positive role students' primary language can play in science instruction. I should also mention that for the BCLAD teachers, there were several different kinds of teaching situations. Some of them were teaching in primary language situations. Some of them were teaching in English-only situations, even though they were BCLAD teachers. And some of them were actually teaching in two-way immersion programs, which I think is also a different configuration. And as Marco mentioned also, some of them were teaching in Cantonese and some of them were teaching in Spanish. So we're talking about a very diverse group of BCLAD teachers, right? And that's also something important to note. In terms of the observations, we did observe these folks 3 times. And we see some differences here that are important to note along those 5 language domains, or 5 language domains that we mentioned earlier. However, the one that we see the most difference in is the one we bold here, science discourse. We see the most change there over time in science discourse. And we find that is an interesting finding, because we were not necessarily thinking that was going to be something that we would see more of over time, particularly when you think about the fact that BCLAD teachers are traditionally trained more to do vocabulary instruction as part of their traditional BCLAD methodology. You would think that would be something that would continue to grow or be more emphasized, but we see that science discourse is something that actually that comes out a lot more, and maybe is related to some of the activities going on in the science methods course. Here I'm gonna read a real quick interaction that occurred in one of these lessons. I'll read it in Spanish and folks can follow it in English. And the point of this excerpt is just to point out that these language domains are integrated. We're not talking about just science discourse. We're talking about vocabulary. We're talking about the use of primary language through the 5 standards, through conversation. So I'll just read this quickly just to point out how this was going on in the classroom. So the teacher starts off with a question. Si estás corriendo y necesitas brincar, ¿qué necesitas para brincar? Dile a tu pareja qué fuerza estás o están usando. And there's a pause. And then Alondra. Gravedad. Okay, gravedad, Erika. Empuje. The teacher adds, empuje, otra. ¿Quién más quiere decir? Another student says, lo primero viene el empuje, después viene la gravedad. And the teacher responds, okay, muy bien, más, Josué. And finally, the student says, primero viene el empuje, luego la gravedad, si no vas a flotar toda tu vida. So there's a sort of engagement by students about the initial question, and that goes on to a really neat conversation about conceptions of gravity, personal experiences with gravity, what happens when they go to the roller coaster, how come people don't fall down, how come folks stay seated. And so there's a real neat conversation that builds from this language development domain that we see here. In terms of language and literacy and other science practices, in terms of these observations, we see that language and literacy science practices were present with these BCLAD teachers, obviously in this excerpt that you saw here as being one of those examples. We also see that these practices were found to be situated between introducing and implementing. That means that they were between a 1 and a 2. So our score relied on a 0, 1, 2, 3 rating, and they were between a 1 and a 2. So it's sort of a mid-level kind of implementation. And we also see differences across data points that was found mostly with the science discourse, as I already mentioned before. We also see some differences in terms of the primary language. With teachers that were teaching the primary language, meaning who were teaching in English, when the primary language was English, even though they were BCLAD teachers, we see a higher level of initial practices of these language domains. And we see some growth over time, as you can see there. In the second column, you see the folks who are teaching in bilingual settings, meaning in Spanish or Cantonese. We see a lower initial implementation of these language domains, but a very quick sort of catch-up to these practices over time. In fact, outpacing the folks who teach in English only. And we're really trying to explain this phenomenon. One possible explanation we think is that students begin to work together with teachers who are not as comfortable with the academic language in Spanish or Cantonese and sort of help them out. That's one explanation that we're thinking about and want to analyze that. So this is sort of a real finding that we want to unpack some more in our later research. Finally, we see that the practices in language integrations are mediated by language instruction. Obviously, we just mentioned that there are differences between primary and sort of bilingual settings. BCLAT teachers that taught science to students' primary language involve additional attention to the discourse of science than BCLAT teachers that taught science in English, so, as I mentioned already. And that regardless of the language of instruction, BCLAT teachers did not differ in their use of instructional attention to science vocabulary. So that occurred throughout. And I just mentioned a little bit about these limitations, and I think Trish will close it off with the conclusion. In terms of limitations, we're still collecting data on the control group. We really want to find out how does this compare to traditional student teaching situations, and we have that data. We really want to see where those distinctions occur, both in terms of the traditional science course methodology, but also in terms of the student teaching practices for folks who are not trained in CREDE. That's one. The second is that we found that there might be a problem with the length of the survey. Overall, we had over 100 plus items for the survey that covered all the domains. We only mentioned a partial list in this study, so you can see how there might be some diminishing returns there. But we feel like we definitely can build on the findings, and we have some very sort of interesting patterns there with other domains. And finally, we find that there might be some issues there in terms of the observations. Some folks had to pack in all the observations during that one time they were still teaching before they went off track. So they had to be packed in within 3 or 4 weeks. Some of them were observed over the course of the semester. So that might be an issue. And also, some folks had a little bit of more chance to sort of pick up after the methods course ended and when they started student teaching. And so sort of that window between that is something we want to look at more closely. So I'm going to give it over to Trish, who will give us our final concluding remarks.
Yeah, so that was just a snapshot of a small piece of our data. We hope to have our database complete in the next month. And then we'll be doing a lot more analysis over the summer. You know, there are challenges with this. We didn't get as many student teachers admitted to the programs as they predicted would be admitted. A large group of student teachers didn't go into student teaching because they hadn't passed the tests. And then in terms of following people up in their first year of teaching, economy. Teachers are not being hired. So there were a lot of challenges around good, luckily this was a development grant, and so, IES has been quite forgiving about it. So given the kinds of unanticipated things you encounter when you're doing this kind of research, we've worked hard to get a fairly comprehensive and complete database with a sufficient N in all the cells to be able to do proper control experimental comparisons. We were unable to do the large-scale follow-up data collection on student achievement because of the employment situation for beginning teachers, so we changed our design with the approval of IES, and we've done some very intensive case studies in San Francisco, and that data, Maxine, have we got all that data? Good. So we will actually have some related student achievement outcome data this summer. So we've given you a flavor of what we've got. What I found interesting about Anula's presentation, lots of things obviously very powerful and very interesting, but it seems to me that you were saying that language and literacy and instructional conversation were two of the domains where you were seeing movement. Is that correct, Anula?
We see movement in all of the standards, but the ones that grow the slowest
Yes.
time of contextualization and instructional conversation.
Yes, that's right. What's interesting is that what we're finding in our data is something similar, The standard which the student teachers were having most difficulty in implementing was contextualization, which was surprising to us. We've seen the most growth, I think, in language and literacy, but we're also seeing increased use of instructional conversation. Now, given the brief duration of the study, so the relative weakness of the treatment, 14-week science methods course, I think to get, and the small number that we had in the sample, I think it's very encouraging. Unfortunately, IES has decided they're not going to fund anymore. We had hoped to go on to an efficacy study after this, where we could actually take what we've learned and move it forward. IES are not funding any more pre-service teacher preparation proposals, but fortunately, because of previous work we'd done with NSF on science and language, they have given us some funding to move forward with San Diego State and San Francisco State. So we will be taking what we found here and moving it forward in a second stage of the study, and with, we hope, a stronger intervention.